Hello, this is Brian Albright, Editorial Director of Digital Engineering Magazine, and welcome to the DE 24/7 podcast. I'm here today with Marco Turchetto, VOLTA Product Manager at ESTECO. Welcome to the program, Marco.
Hello, welcome. Thanks, Brian, for having me at the podcast.
Great. Well, what I wanted to talk about today with you is this idea of the democratization of simulation. Here at Digital Engineering, we talk a lot about that. At ESTECO, what does that concept of democratization mean, and why do you think that's important?
Okay, so when we talk about the democratization, I always like to distinguish between which kind of democratization, and I always find two types of that. So the first type is the democratization of the simulation tool. So meaning the simulation software is easy enough for the non-simulation experts to perform simulation. But when performing simulation nowadays, you will always get a result and a colorful picture with the modern software. And those pictures and results always seems reasonable, not to a non-simulation expert. But the real point is, can those results be used to take design decisions? And those results, how close enough are they to the reality? So performing simulation to get results that are representative of the reality always requires two different things. So the first one is the knowledge, and the second one is the expertise. So without those, it's really impossible to understand if a result is meaningful or is just a colorful picture. And I always like this joke about CFD. So CFD can mean two different things. So the first one is computational fluid dynamics, and the second one is colorful fluid dynamics. So we always get a colorful picture, but how close is that to the reality?
Right.
The second one, of course, colorful fluid dynamics, is absolutely useless. So the second type of democratization, which is the one I like the most and has the most value, is the democratization of the knowledge and the expertise of the simulation expert to a simulation end user. So specifically a designer in most of the cases. Really, this is the democratization which has the most value. So for ESTECO, democratization means turning simulation from an expert-only service into an on-demand product, so that designers, simulation and users can perform simulation, high-quality simulation, with the expertise and the knowledge of the simulation expert themselves. In this way, you can really enable the non-simulation expert to take design decisions early in the product development cycle with high-quality simulations, because those simulations were set up by the simulation experts. Simulation users in this way, they can really use in a confident way the results that come from the simulation, which has been democratized to them.
What are some of the challenges around sort of exposing that information and knowledge to non-experts that companies face?
There are many challenges in my opinion, around the simulation democratization. So the first that comes to my mind is the risk of misinterpretation of the results. So when a non-expert uses a simplified app or easy way to perform a simulation, they might treat the results as an absolute truth without really understanding the context. And this happens because a simulation result is only valid within certain physical assumptions or physical bounds. Like, for instance, a specific temperature range in a heat simulation. Outside those bounds, the results can also be meaningless or can be assumed to be incorrect. So this is the first risk. So user pushing a simulation outside of those bounds, the software might still give an answer which is kind of reasonable or looks reasonable, but the answer could be physically impossible. Then there is a second risk which I see, which is the risk of the expert bottleneck in the app creation. So when we talk about the simulation in companies, usually the number of designers is 10 or even 100 times the number of simulation experts. And so when I talk about the bottleneck in the app creation, I mean that the simulation expert need to create those simulation app or simulation ways to democratize the simulation. So they are not spending time in repeated simulation with low value, but they are spending the time in configuring those simulation app to democratize the simulation to the simulation end user or designers in general. this is the risk that the second risk that I see. Then the third risk, which I think this is riskier of all, which is the risk, the data governance and the digital thread challenge, I would like to call. So the point is you can democratize the simulation, which also sits on your desktop. You can have your simulation, and then you can share it with someone else, and then you can teach them how to use the simulation software. But this is a very big mistake because what you cannot do is you cannot trace who is using that simulation. The approach should be the other way around. So it should be that you have a central repository of simulation. You use this to democratize the simulation. Because in the end, what you can answer is, okay, what were the simulation models used, how I created the workflow, and then in the end, who used this workflow in a democratized fashion, and what results were generated out of that.
Can you expand a little bit more then and explain how, Volta as a platform helps companies with this process?
Yeah, we've been researching quite a lot in this fields of democratization since many years. So, and I think we have the solution to all these challenges. So we've worked on those. So let me start from the first challenge. So the misinterpretation of the results. So at ESTECO, we understand that it's very important to give guardrails to the user in general in the software, but in the democratization process as well. So in Volta, which is the digital engineering platform by ESTECO, there are basically two approaches for the simulation democratization. So the first approach is through the planner. The planner is a sort of configurator for the execution of the workflow made by the expert that runs the simulation. And the second approach to the democratization is through a simulation web app, which goes under the name Rambox in our case. So in the planner, going back to the planner approach, the user, so which could be the simulation end user, defines the boundaries of the simulation, but it is guardrailed by the boundaries set by the simulation expert. So let me try to put this into an example. Let's say we have a thermal simulation. So the expert user sets up the project domain, so the domain of validity of the simulation, knowing that outside of that domain, the simulation results become unrealistic. For instance, in this heat transfer example, the simulation expert sets the validity range for the temperature, let's say between 50 and 100. Then the designer or the simulation end user cannot go outside of those bounds, as the planner will limit the variability of those parameters according to what has been set by the simulation expert. So in this way, you are confident to generate results which are feasible because they are in the boundary domain of the project. The solution to the second problem I was mentioning goes through a standardized process. And this is the way we solved in ESTECO. So the simulation expert creates the simulation workflow, validates it, and then publish it into the Volta platform. As everything is standardized within the product, here's where the magic happens. So with a standardized way of building the workflow, for us it's very easy to automatically deploy those workflows as simulation web apps that can be used by the designers to perform the simulation. So we simply get the workflow, and as it is standardized within Volta, we interpret it as a simulation web app, which can be used by the designer. For this trend, for this approach, we developed Rambox, which is a verticalization of Volta based on Volta public APIs that allows the designers to access a simplified and intuitive web GUI to request simulation analysis. The last risk, the risk that goes under the name of the digital thread risk, what Volta can do is prove that the simulation democratization has benefit to also allows to keep everything under control. So every simulation model, every workflow is stored in Volta so that it's possible to keep track of which simulation models were used, in which simulation workflows they were used and actually who ran those workflows, and especially what the results were generated by those simulation apps and which design decisions were taken. And this is possible only with a centralized approach. So with in our case with Volta, which keeps track of all the different simulations. It doesn't matter if those are democratized and used by the designers or performed by simulation experts.
You mentioned this a few times, but could you tell me a little bit more about Runbox and how engineers actually use that in these types of workflows?
Runbox is a public API-based application that really hides completely the complexity of the simulation and is able to democratize it to the designers. So we were talking about the difficulty in setting up a significant simulation to get results close to the reality. Then we talk about the difficulty of orchestrating the simulation and building the guardrails to avoid the misuse of this simulation. Then the last mile problem is how do I get designers to use the simulation in an easy way? They are not simulation experts, so they need easy GUI, an intuitive GUI to input only the parameters that they understand that they need and click a button. And this is what happens with Runbox. So the designer logs into Runbox, selects the simulation which has been democratized to them, provide some inputs, so input some parameters, and then click a button. What happens behind the scenes is managed by Volta. So the simulation is set up, is sent to the computing resources, is run, and then the results are automatically extracted from the simulation and presented to the designer. So the designer never leaves Runbox, input some parameters they know, click a button, and then they are presented with the results. Usually they don't need the entire simulation results. So this is why I always want to stress the fact that the results that are interested to the designers are extracted and proposed to them. And about Runbox, we have recently hosted a webinar about it, where we presented how it is possible to democratize a fluid structure interaction simulation to a designer. And those FSI simulations are very complex simulations as they are multidisciplinary by definition. And in the webinar, we showed how we could run a fluid dynamics simulation to extract the forces which act on a front wing of a car, and how those forces are then injected into the structural simulation, and how the results then are presented easily to the designer.
All right. Well, I would encourage all of our listeners to check that out. Thank you very much for your time today, Marco. It was great talking to you.
Thanks to you, Brian, and thanks to all the audience.
Right. And thank you all for listening. I'll see you or hear you next time on next edition of the DE 24/7 podcast.